Welcome back and thanks for staying with us. This is the second half of this broadcast, and tonight we are talking the budget KE. The hashtag, of course, is budget KE, budget 2022 KE. On Twitter, we can interact if you use that. Our Twitter handle is at TV47KE. Mine is at Eric_Mnene. You can join in the conversation also using our SMS line. You can text us live on 22047. That is our SMS line. In studio, I have with me an economist, Raphael Matu. Karibu sana once again.
Thank you.
And I'd like to start with a question that my editorial director, Macharia Gashuru, is asking.
Okay.
Everybody's talking about leaders faulting this budget. But what exactly is this budget really about, from where you sit as an economist?
So I think from my point of view is a transition kind of a budget, and that is why it's a bit unique compared to what we had previously, and maybe that is why it came earlier in the month of April. My view, of course, is that within this budget, it depends again the political kind of alignment. You know, politicians will always have something to comment about depending on where they sit. There are those ones who will say the budget is very okay, 100%. There are those ones who will see nothing good about the budget. So I think there are quite some issues, good issues, which were raised in the budget, and some kind of progression, a bit of preparation for transition. Definitely, of course, there must be a few items here and there, which maybe as we go through the discussions, we can pick maybe that could have been done better. Yeah.
And you know, the government said that the CS said that while they were preparing this budget, he said that they extensively consulted Kenyans, and a key among the concerns that they were getting was the high cost of living, unemployment, income inequality, and the public debt burden, and of course, as you've mentioned earlier on, you've said that it's quite an emotive issue, and a lot of people are looking at it in a simplistic way. But has the budget read out by the CS factored in by the Wanjiku? And I want us to have a look at some of the views by the Wanjiku before we go on with this discussion.
All right.
Well, I do understand that that clip is being prepared there by my producer. But in your view, do you think that this budget was really has really factored in the concerns of the Wanjiku?
Yeah, very true. As you have said, the Cabinet Secretary started by highlighting the economic challenges, as you have just mentioned them. And maybe there could be an imbalance between what Wanjiku had really expected and maybe what the government was able to do. I want to believe from some of the things I was listening to, or maybe when you even listen to the members of the public, I think people also need to understand that the government no longer directly controls the prices for goods and services. We are not in the 80s and the early 90s where the government would wake up and say during the budget, from tonight, maybe the price for unga is 120 shillings or 110 shillings, thereabout. The government can only control the prices through policy. So I think as we look at answers, whether the budget was able to address the concerns of Wanjiku, we can only look at the policies in terms of the taxes, what was done maybe regarding taxation, or maybe regarding expenditures. Did we spend on some areas which maybe we think Wanjiku is likely to get some kind of relief? Otherwise, I think from the general public, there's a tendency of the public still to think that the government has powers to just wake up and say from tonight the price of milk, the price of unga, the price of this will be that much. In fact, we only have some price controls within the fuel industry, and of course we can see we have challenges already. And
I wanted us to come to that, because when you say that the government doesn't really directly control the
prices,
the prices of basic commodities, but then again when the government comes in and shows that when it provides some subsidies, then some prices can go down, then the common mwananchi will think, this is all government's doing. Yeah, and that's why I said the expectations and maybe the actions, maybe that is where the gap may come in. Because like I have said, there are those who really think the government can control the prices, and maybe they expected after the budget, the government will just come and say unga is down from maybe 150 shillings to 120 shillings. Remember that one cannot happen, and
even if we were to give the subsidies which you're talking about, maybe we don't expect that to have an immediate effect. Even if we talk about maybe things like we were talking about reduction in the cost of fertilizers, we don't expect to see the results tomorrow. When you talk about maybe even a reduction in taxes, remember there is already in stock some commodities which were produced before the taxes were reduced. So that they will still hold that market price before the effect of a reduction in tax can be felt. So compared to what used to happen traditionally, where the effect was immediate. So the effect in most cases cannot really be immediate on some of these interventions moving forward. Yeah, so there could be that kind of an imbalance between Wanjiku expecting that the budget is today, the cost of living should go down today, and maybe probably the time it takes for the policy and some of those actions or interventions to take place.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Let's listen into what the Wanjiku has to say about that budget.
Lakini nimeona serikali wamesoma budget, wajatufukusia vitu, mafuta ni bei kali, sisi tuko na shida, hatuna kazi yetu ilimaliziwa na corona, kazi yetu ilifungwa, sisi ni watu ya bodaboda, tena kazi imefungwa, tunasema serikali tusaidie, watusaidii, tuko na watoto wanasoma, wanunuliwi vitambu, sisi jamii tuko na shida sana. Tafadhali serikali itupunguzie vitu kama chakula hivi. Juu mafuta ya kukula hata ni shida, tunakula chakula ya kuchemshwa siku hizi. Juu watoto watakufa na njaa. Sisi wengine ni watu ya kupanga nyumba, hatuna pesa ya kupanga nyumba, kazi imeisha, vitu imepanda bei, tutafanyaje serikali? Serikali tufukusieni vitu, turegeseni pesa, tafadhali. Sisi hatuna namna, hatuna mbele wala nyuma, ni kuisha serikali tunaisha.
Na nimeshangaa leo budget imesomwa na serikali haijaongelea juu ya bei ya vyakula, maziwa imeenda juu, mafuta imeenda juu, hakuna kitu chochote ambacho wameongelea juu yake. Hiyo ni msangao kwa mwananchi wa kawaida. Lakini nalilia serikali kama watasikia kilio ya mwananchi, tafadhali tupatie mafuta ya kufanya kazi, punguzia watu vyakula, watu wanakufa njaa.
Even as you see the budget allocation for health, one may presume that that is really good money. It may be good, but it is not sufficient. Looking at the health, even just the healthcare workers alone, we are far from attaining the World Health Organization recommendations.
Well, Raphael, Wanjiku has spoken. Quite gloomy, nothing to smile about.
Yeah, definitely. We accept and we must agree that the cost of living is biting on everyone. And it's not just Wanjiku, remember, it's also biting even on those people who are in business, those who are entrepreneurs. Yep. And like you have just seen from the clip, like I said, maybe to the common mwananchi, they would expect that when we read the budget, by the time the minister or the cabinet secretary is finishing the statement, the prices for goods will have drastically gone down. So as I said, it cannot really happen because we cannot really go back to the element of price controls in a let's say a liberalized economy, like in our case. Price controls may not really work. Maybe I may want to take you back to what happened in 2017. Remember, as we were heading to elections 2017, we had an unga crisis again. The cost of living was very high and price of unga was almost unaffordable. And consequently, the government had to intervene by giving us subsidies to the millers. And remember, that was not price controls. But even before the subsidy could take effect, we stayed almost a whole 1 month without taking ugali because unga was not available. You can now try to imagine if it was a price control where you wake up and say, you cannot sell unga at 150 shillings, you can only sell at 90 shillings. It cannot happen if we had to struggle even with the subsidies to make things work. So I think what people also need to realize is that even as we talk about Wanjiku, remember the same government also protects the producer as well. So it is not really possible to dictate prices. Like for example, I'm a businessman, maybe I have a kiosk. Maybe I bought a kilogram of sugar at say 150 shillings. Maybe I'm selling it at 150, 170 to make a margin of 20 shillings. So the government cannot just wake up today and tell me you have to sell that sugar at 140 shillings. It cannot work. unless the government is willing to top up the 30 shillings so that I can be able to get my 30 shillings in terms of a subsidy. So people need to understand as I said earlier, there's always a gap between policy effects before they can be felt. Because like now you're talking about reducing the cost of fertilizers, as we may have seen this week. We don't expect that is going to affect the agricultural products tomorrow, but maybe probably in the next 1 or 2 months moving forward. So I think that gap, that failure, people to understand that the government does not directly control the prices. It can only work through taxes or maybe through spending in certain sectors. I think that is where the big gap is. But it's acceptable that the cost of living is high. Everybody is crying, and I think all these policy issues need to be put up in place. But the most important thing is to find out what are some of the causes of these challenges. Can we be able to avoid them? And the others that are not avoidable, what do we need to do? The other thing is, of course, is a very delicate balance between Wanjiku on one side and the revenue mobilization of the state. In fact, it's like the government and Wanjiku, they are almost in the same position. So
how is that? In what ways?
It's like we are crying for help from a government which is also equally struggling to mobilize revenues to be able to meet its requirements. So, and that is why you see, I think we would have expected maybe the government to lower like some taxes on commodities, which they didn't. Or what they did is they avoided any further increment on taxes on these basic commodities. So remember again, that is a big sacrifice in terms of the revenue collection. So how do you balance between welfare, Wanjiku's welfare, and revenue mobilization? Again, because we are talking about deficits on the other side. Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
Well, it is. And I want us to go back to what the CS said. The process, the budget-making process that, of course, has culminated today with him making the pronouncement, it's quite a long process. And this year, it has been shortened. And we have to appreciate the fact that we are headed to a general election. But then again, there were things that he said, and it got me thinking, like, for instance, saying that directing government ministries, departments, and agencies, MDAs, as well as county governments to clear their pending bills by the 30th of June. Such measures, do you think it's quite practical?
Okay. I think we understand what has happened this year is not different from also what happened in 2017. Trying to bring our calendar ahead of time so that, of course, we can be able to give provisions, especially preparations for elections. And because like IBC matters to deal with security, we need to put up the judiciary quite set, because we expect a lot of cases coming in after elections and so forth. So I think all those processes have really pushed. There's always a calendar that normally starts from July. Running all the way to June as we get the budget presented. I think what they did is just to try to squeeze the process to make sure that the budget is ready by today, or rather by April. And remember, it is supposed again to be harmonized with the other members of the East African community. So which, of course, he clarified that of course they have also been able to talk to them, and they know exactly why our budget had to come a bit earlier. So moving forward in terms of the clearance of the bills, we must admit there are always some challenges between the central government or the national government and counties, mostly in terms of revenue and in terms of disbursement of funding. So I think unless maybe they also do commit to make sure that the counties are able to get money on time. But when responding to that question, his argument, of course, was that we have challenges as to when we get as the revenues come in. So we're hoping that as they get the revenues, they should be able to help the counties and the ministries and other agencies to clear their pending bills. And
then there's something he said about Kenya moving from a low-income country to a low-middle-income country. And is this factored in? Because now we are in a debt crisis. When we are repaying the loans, will that be one of the factors that are factored in?
I did not really catch up on that, the issue of moving to a high middle income country. I think we are still, in my view, I still believe that we are still on a low middle income country. The issue may not really be the debt as to what we may be focusing on. One of the indicators I want to believe could be in terms of the per capita incomes in the country. I don't think it may go to the issue of really the payment of debt may not really be an indicator. Because we still have, of course, high countries with high levels of debts, and yet they belong to the categories of developed nations. So I think the repayment of debt may not really be one of the indicators as to moving from one class to another, but probably the levels of GDP and the per capita incomes in the country. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about something also that is quite emotive. I've seen the conversation online, and of course offline people are talking about our national carrier, that is Kenya Airways.
Yeah.
The CA is saying that it plays a major role in the economic development of this country. He also appreciated the fact that it is facing a severe cash crisis,
yeah.
And that they are going to do everything as the government to see to it that it remains afloat. In your opinion, do you think it's now time for the airline probably to look at another business model, probably because, and this question is influenced by what I've seen online and what people are saying about the airline. Some are even calling it a non-profit making organization.
Yeah.
So is it time probably that they look at other business models?
So I think it is true that we have really invested quite a lot of money in Kenya Airways. Started making a lot of losses, maybe quite some time back. And according to the budget speech, the argument was that there will be a lot of restructuring, and maybe probably which the cabinet secretary was not very clear what kind of restructuring is it in terms of cutting down in terms of employees, is it in terms of the flights, is it maybe redirection in terms of the routes that maybe probably we are covering as KQ. I think we are yet to see that, but I think yes, to the feeling of most people, we have really invested in KQ. I still believe that yes, as he says, let's say something is an asset which is crucial for us as a country, and he tried also to give quite a number of reasons, and say being a center maybe for Africa, and maybe we need like Kenya Airways is crucial to us. So to my view, he gave, in fact, he did not just talk about Kenya Airways, he talked about many parastatals which are really not doing very well, and he tried to put up quite a number of measures that need to be put up in place, and to make sure that these organizations are really running into a profitable kind of, or even if they're not profitable, they should be sustainable in a way. Yeah, so I think it is a long debate, but we may need to see this kind of restructuring he talked about. What does it really entail? Yeah.
And when such a situation happens, when now you have many state corporations making massive losses, so what happens? Do we go ahead and borrow some more? Like this year, I understand we had a deficit of 800 billion shillings. Do we borrow some more, and do we tell those foreign investors that this is what has been happening for the past, say, 10 years, and now we want to pump some more money to these corporations so that they can have at least some lifeline?
I think state corporations have had challenges for quite a long time, and there's been a lot of inefficiencies in terms of the government-run organizations. And I think one of the reasons why is simply because they're not profit-making. You know, when we go to the private sector, we know that people have to work extremely very hard. If at all you have to earn something, if you're a business person, and you expect something by the end of the month or by the end of the year, then of course you really have to put in quite a lot of effort. So I think it becomes a big burden, if I may accept that, when most of these corporations are really making losses and they have to be supported by the government. A lot of they contribute heavily towards losses, and that is, I think, where restructuring come in to make sure that they are quite efficient. Maybe in terms of hiring of even the people who are managing these corporations, could be they, maybe probably we can do it on contractual basis, and many others, so that if you are not performing, then you cannot be sustained there. So I think we should be able to base their sustainability basically on performance and contracting performance, or rather putting people in contract in terms of their work, and sustaining them if only they can be able to give us results. I think that could be the way forward. So there will be need, of course, to restructure some of these organizations, maybe to merge others, because you may also realize that in quite a number of them there could be multiplicity of functions, meaning that maybe they are not relevant. There could also be a bit of streamlining, because you also realize that apart from the fact that there could be duplicating duties, there could also be conflict of interest. There are certain government entities where you find that they're fighting for common resources, and in the process both of them do not perform, especially when we have now maybe probably to go to a stalemate before we can be able to move forward. So I think the best way is to restructure. Otherwise, as we have said, we must admit they put us into huge crisis if we have a big number of parastatals which need to be built out.
Well, and Matu, I have to mention that the Wanjiku is still talking to us
yes,
via Facebook and at Twitter.
Yeah.
At Facebook, I have Michael Kabugi who's saying we hear of billions, government talk of billions, but we don't see it mashinani.
Okay.
And then someone here says no to such huge amounts. They'll eat, so to speak. They'll eat all that amount, and there'll be nothing to show at the end of this term.
In fact, I think that if I may agree with Wanjiku at some point, that is the biggest challenge that we have as a country. Remember, reading the budget and doing allocations is one thing, but getting the resources to the final beneficiary and more maybe to Wanjiku on the ground is another. And one of the biggest challenge, of course, we have as a country is the management of public resources. I want to believe that if we were able to succeed, or we were able to put up proper war against corruption, even the kind of deficits that we are talking about in terms of borrowing, they could not exist. Because I want to believe that as we borrow some money, especially to go to projects, part of this money may have been lost maybe along the way, and some of these projects may have to be completed. Some people even keep on asking, why are we still getting more money, and part of the money may have been lost. Maybe at times you get to a point whereby the projects have to be completed, and it would be worse maybe to leave them hanging rather than to continue to complete them. So even if maybe some money was lost, maybe more money may be needed to complete these projects. Otherwise, it could be double tragedy when we lose some money and then the others, we leave them half complete, and then they don't serve any purpose. Yeah.
Well, when you mentioned that a lot of people you've heard that people saying that we don't need to borrow more if there's money that is lost because of poor management of public resources. It reminds me of when Kenyans last year really went ahead, and even at one instance stormed a virtual meeting of the IMF. Okay. It might not have achieved much really, but then again, I think those behind coming up with the policies of this country, I believe, and I want you to tell me if you think what I believe is right. Yeah. You think really they look at the mood and some of these comments that Kenyans make online, and do they really consider that when they come up with policies like the budget policy statement? I know it's a simplistic way of reasoning, but then again, the impact, you have to look at the Wanjiku, because all I am saying right here is Wanjiku talking about corruption. Do you think those behind such policies really consider that?
Are you talking about the ones who are lending to us, or the ones who are borrowing
Not really
on our behalf?
The ones borrowing on our behalf.
I think there are some. Let's first of all look at it from two different sides. We need to think about from lenders, and then maybe probably on the side of the borrower. The side of the borrower, maybe he looks at his needs, and as we borrow, do we have projects that we want to undertake, whether maybe money was lost or not. In fact, we should be thinking about the lender. So what does the lender really consider? And here you realize that we have two kinds of debts. If you look at maybe concessional loans and maybe loans we get from World Bank, IMF, for them they're a bit more, they will do a bit of scrutiny as to what you're doing. They also want to follow up along how the projects are going and so forth. But you also realize that on the other side, we have some commercial loans. Some commercial loans, they're a bit easy, and although they're expensive, they don't really come with a lot of conditions.
Yeah.
So I think you may realize that most of the funding that maybe gets mismanaged mostly is maybe money that is coming from the commercial loans rather than from the concessional loans. But that said and done, as I have said, I've just mentioned earlier, you may also realize that even if we have borrowed and maybe some projects have stalled, so at times even a negotiation with our lenders comes in handy, that maybe some of these projects, they are better off completed rather than left completed. So at times we get to move on and we continue lending. I remember I got a question, I don't know, that was the last time when I was here in the studio, and there was also an issue of the freezing of employment of civil servants. And someone was asking, how come maybe probably there has been a window opened, and according to agreement with our development partners, maybe we were supposed to have frozen the recruitment. So things also change along the way, because you realize that, for example, we have people who are leaving the civil service, we have people who are retiring from the civil service, and along the way, even if we had said no recruitment, we need these skills. So there will be some things that maybe will change moving forward. So we may have to make decisions based on the prevailing circumstances. So that is why I've said, even if maybe money was lost in certain projects, we may need to get more money maybe for completion rather than leaving them hanging.
Okay, thank you. Remember, you're watching the Game Plan 2022. We are talking about the budget, trying to make sense of what the Treasury CS, that is Okorie Attorney, made when he made the pronouncement of the budget, when he made the statement rather on the budget. Remember, it is a process, it's a whole process. I have with me Raphael Matu, who's an economist. We're trying to make sense of that. And I'm looking at a lot of
questions.
Yes, a lot of questions, and some of them I can't. Yes, I'm getting some of the feedback from Wanjiku, and some of them I can't read them on air.
Okay.
But mostly it's that issue of corruption.
Yeah.
You're talking about the borrowers and those who borrow money on behalf of Kenyans. Let's talk about the lenders.
Okay.
Are they aware of this fact?
As I have said, there could be two categories. There are two categories of lenders. And when you talk about maybe borrowing from international bodies like IMF, World Bank, and the likes, we have said, of course, their loans comes with conditions, and maybe, again, you have to meet certain criteria for you to get them. But when you maybe, for example, we talk about commercial loans, maybe you realize that those ones may not have a lot of conditionalities and maybe a lot of restrictions. And like I said, maybe in most cases, that is where we may end up losing most of the resources. But despite corruption, because we started by mentioning quite a number of challenges, we already talked about a high cost of living, which is really biting. We had talked about maybe challenges regarding relating to unemployment and so forth. You realize that quite a number of these challenges, they are also in relation to policy issues. So who are our policymakers, or who are our decision makers? In most cases, you realize that most of these policies, whether they're in agriculture, whether we're in education, whether we are talking about manufacturing, they are made by our elected leaders. So again, this takes Wanjiku now back to task. Because even as Wanjiku is complaining and is going through the pain, Wanjiku must also realize has a very, very important role to play. So what kind of leaders do you put in place in Parliament to discuss your agricultural policies? What kind of people are you putting in place in Parliament to discuss our maybe manufacturing industry, our educational policies, and so forth? Are they people who are capable of moving these policies and making sure that the government is able to get clear policies, which of course can lead, and this of course is a long-term solution, so that we don't find ourselves in these problems. We have been talking about Kenya not being able to feed itself or its people, yet we are almost talking about 60 years after independence. So there are some things we keep on repeating the same thing. Okay. Do we know countries which are arid and semi-arid and they can even export food? They are there. So what do our policy makers that we elect to do? And that is why it is very clear, moving to August, it is very clear for Wanjiku to understand, from the MCA to members of Parliament to the governors, to the senators, all the way to the president. It is very, very important to be very clear on who we put into the ballot.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Raphael Matu, for that insight. Time now for a very, very short break. Game Plan 2022 will be back shortly. We're talking about the budget 2022-2023. We'll be back with more. Don't go away.
of Untold Stories.
Welcome back to Game Plan 2022. We are talking about the game of numbers, the budget 2022-2023, and to discuss that I have with me Raphael Matu, who's an economist. And just before we went on a break, we were talking about some of the things that those who make policy on behalf of Kenyans consider. What actually really determines how the government mobilizes for revenue, like taxing basic commodities?
Yeah, when, like I said, we need to understand the government does not really have its own money. Mm-hmm. So the main source of government revenue is either the tax or the debt. And I think when we started the interview sometime earlier, I think I said the more government gets involved in the economy, as we are now talking about free education, we are talking about affordable healthcare, universal healthcare, and so many other activities, infrastructural projects and so forth, the higher the revenue needs for the government. And consequently, either the higher the tax or the higher the debt. At times, in fact, when you talk about debt, we look at the debt as delayed taxation. In fact, they are more or less the same, because it means that in the long run, we still have to pay the debts through taxation. And when we are looking for revenue, and we need to get the revenue through taxes, then we have to target certain products. We need to understand that, again, most people, when they're looking at taxes, especially now if I talk on my side as an accountant, we tend to think that taxes are purely for revenue purposes. We need to understand that we tax for different reasons. Beyond revenue, we tax maybe for protection, maybe when you're trying to protect our local industry. Others are done for social welfare. We need to discourage people from consuming certain goods and services. Other taxes are meant for fair distribution of incomes. For example, when we tax the rich people more than the poor. So it depends. When you listen to the budget and you hear various commodities being targeted, then you need to ask what was the policy direction, or what was the aim of that policy. And when we are now you're asking about looking at commodities for revenue purposes. These commodities must be those commodities that will guarantee the government the revenue. There is normally a misconception where people keep on saying we need to tax less on basic commodities and then we tax more on luxuries. That is easily said in theory, but it is not practical in economic policy. In fact, it is, in terms of policy, it is the reverse. That basic commodities, be it sugar, be it milk, be it bread, be it unga, those are the commodities which people must always consume. And therefore, they guarantee the government the revenue, simply because, in fact, we look at the response. Yeah. If one thing we need to understand is that when there is a tax, it will bring about an increase in the prices for goods and services. So if the prices go up, do people buy these things or don't they buy them? So for basic commodities, we still consume them despite the fact that the prices have gone up. And the same thing happens. You realize in the budget today there was a touch on beer and cigarettes, things to do with gaming and the likes, right? Yep. Those ones now, again, we call them as habit forming. Because when you form a habit, even if the prices go up, maybe for example, somebody who is a member na anakunywaga zake mbili tatu, this person will not fail to take his 2-3 simply because the price of beer has gone up by 50 shillings or by even maybe 30 shillings per bottle of beer because of the tax. So those ones, again, they belong to the category of products which are very good for tax purposes. But like I said earlier, now the irony is you need revenue, and those are the best commodities for revenue. You'll be guaranteed of revenue as an economic planner. But the question is, as a developing country, there also happens to be the things which are putting Wanjiku on the farthest end, on the extreme end, in terms of the cost of living. So how do we balance the two? That you're mobilizing revenue, and these are the best commodities for revenue mobilization, and you also want to protect Wanjiku. And that is why you realize in the budget, there was no reduction in terms of taxes. All what the cabinet secretary did, tried to avoid any additional taxes on basic commodities, and also try to guarantee us that the subsidy on the fuel will be continued, because again you realize fuel is something that you use every day, and that is why again you can see there is quite a huge amount of tax on fuel, so that of course we can be able to mobilize enough revenue for the government. So it is quite a great irony, but unfortunately that is the policy, that these commodities are the best for tax purposes. We cannot tax luxuries because they will not be bought, and therefore as an economic planner you'll be very desperate because there is no money coming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about fiscal deficit.
Yeah.
This is a government living beyond its means. But the CS says, and I quote him, that the government has plans to reduce the level of fiscal deficit from 8.7% of GDP in the current budget to 7.5% of GDP in the financial year, that's 2021-2022, and further to a 3.6% of budget of GDP, I beg your pardon, in the financial year 2024-2025. Is it practical, and what are some of the measures that the government should employ to achieve such high targets?
I think first of all, when you talk about reducing the fiscal budget, and it is read in terms of percentage, as I said earlier, when you look at gross figures, at times they can be quite misleading. So the figure in terms of the deficit we are seeing is falling to about 7.6%, maybe a target for next year. The figure may still be higher than maybe the current figure, depending on what is going to be the level for the GDP. So therefore what we are seeing is that you're talking about this percentage of the deficit in relation to what. So the figure may still be higher, but the percentage may be lower. If the GDP grows, what we are saying is that as the GDP grows, we intend to have smaller deficits. Small deficits, but in relation to the GDP, not in terms that you say, man, this was 800 and is it supposed to be 860 something?
864?
Yeah, you may realize that if a GDP grows higher at a higher rate, it may even be, maybe next year may even be up to maybe something like 900. So the figure may be higher than the current year, but it may be lower in terms of the percentage. Because the economy is growing or the economy is expanding. And that is why I think at some point earlier I said it's very, very important also to look at those figures in relation to something else, so that of course you do some kind of comparative statistics. But whether the reduction is possible and maybe probably what needs to be done, I think it goes back to the matters on fiscal discipline. So in terms of our management of resources, I think it goes back, how do we really manage our public resources? We have talked about the debt, and maybe I think quite a number of issues. We have even talked about, there was a lot of debate today in the budget about public-private partnership. Those are the PPPs, where we tried to work with the private sector. We said the people in the private sector, of course, they'll be a bit more efficient. They'll be able to question a lot where they're putting their money for investment purposes and so forth. And apart from maybe working with the PPPs, there's need for better evaluation of investment projects, to make sure that as we do the investments in terms of projects that can be able to give us long-term benefits, or rather long-term rewards. I know when you talk about public projects, and especially people who have much information about public finance, but they're not economists, at times they don't get it right, because there is a major distinction between public projects and the private projects. All the way from the objective of the investments, all the way to even how we evaluate these projects for feasibility or maybe for viability. And that is why at times from the finance part of it, you may hear people saying certain projects maybe they are not viable, yet at times as government people proceed on and maybe probably invest on those projects. And the reason could be some of the services that the government is providing, there are things that cannot be provided by the private sector, because they may appear as if they are not commercially viable, if we may use that word. The other thing, of course, is that for government projects, they may give us returns, maybe probably in the long run.
Yes.
Maybe a project that will take about 5 years to complete, but maybe we use it for the next 100 or 200 years. So I think there are so many factors, and I think it's a whole debate to discuss, but I think because we have techniques that can help us to evaluate whether these projects are viable, then it is important that proper feasibility studies, of course economic feasibility studies, not financial feasibility study, but economic viability of these projects be done, so that we can be able to invest on those projects which will be able to give us the highest returns. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about innovation, and there's quite an ambitious project here that the CS says that the government is keen on, and that has to do with the government bonds and trading, establishing an electronic over-the-counter secondary market platform for government securities that is actually for deepening our domestic debt market. And for some reason you're talking about the discipline when it comes to managing public assets. But now also, as with new innovations in this country, we know how things go. What can be done to make sure that this is actually a success?
So I think, like I said earlier, it goes back to our leaders and our policymakers, and especially people and organizations and institutions which are left to undertake the oversight, the oversight role, because if all these activities, if there is proper oversight in terms of how the government is investing its money, how these projects are being undertaken, then I want to believe that we can be able to have proper utilization of resources, and such new innovations that are coming on board, then they can be made to be successful. Again, like I have said earlier, there is still that effort to make sure that the government is working with the private sector is still, I think, another very important point, because like we have said, people within the private sector will always want to put their money where they know that they can be able to get returns. They are profit driven, and I think that is why the private sector becomes more efficient than the government. So I believe proper oversight, and I also want to believe that it is important that in certain areas we try to work with the private sector so that we can bring efficiency.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as we wind up, let's talk about the economic growth.
Okay.
He's painted a very good picture of the economic growth of the country. He said that this year the economy is projected to stabilize at 6.0%, supported by, among other things, favorable weather conditions that will, of course, help farmers reap big from their hard work. And I want to ask you this question in relation to the next Commander-in-Chief. What options does he have?
In terms of?
Well, stabilizing the economy.
I think we all agree that because you talked about the debt earlier, and we said we have already hit our limit. We'll expect that the next government coming in will have quite some challenges in terms of the limited fiscal space that is expected. But I want to also to think that in this budget there's a probability that we may be able to see quite a number of changes when the new regime comes in. Remember, as people go to politics, we are hearing a lot of promises from politicians, and a lot of goodies which are being offered to Wanjiku. I want to say that most of them may not really be practical within the fiscal space that the new government will be getting into. So there'll be quite some reorganization, because I know every government comes in with these priorities. So there could be a bit of changes in terms of the things that have been presented to us today. And over and above that, there will be some possibilities that the promises which will be given to the voters during the campaigns, most of them are not going to be delivered by the new government that will come in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like us to end on that note. Raphael Matthew is an economist trying to make sense of what Treasury CA Sukuri Atani had to say about the budget and the economy, the projections of our economy as a country as we head to the next general election. Thank you so much.
Very much welcome.
Asante sana.
Yeah.
And thank you to viewer for keeping us company until this tail end of this broadcast. On behalf of everyone who made this a success, and of course led by my able director, Sir Nick, with the guidance of my editorial director, Mashara Gashuru, and our award-winning producer, Anthony Murigi, we say asante sana for keeping us company. This has been Game Plan 2022. Keep safe and keep enjoying our wholesome programs. Goodbye.
I hope I have responded to the...